And let's now take you back to Waterkloof Air Force Base in Centurion, where the repatriation process of the 49 anti-apartheid activists from Zimbabwe as well as Zambia is underway. Ziyanda Ngcobo is covering that story for us this afternoon. Ziyanda, once again, a very good afternoon. Tell us about the preparations now. As you indicated a bit earlier on, that there is a delay with the service expected to have started at this particular hour, but not.
Absolutely, and now we're told, we're initially, those who are here whispering to us, they said the plane might be landing at 5. Now it looks like it might be 6, but maybe somewhere between 5 and 6 o'clock. And I can tell you, Aldrin, one of the most fascinating things about just being in the space with the families of those who are waiting for the remains of their loved ones is just hearing the stories of exile, just hearing, the fond memories that those who are here are sharing with us. And I'm going to be joined by the brother of Basil Feb. Now, his story is quite interesting, Aldrin, because Basil Feb, he was born in District 6 in 1944, and eventually, he actually joined Umkhonto weSizwe in the 60s, and I think 1964 is the date, and he became quite an asset, so much so that when he left the country, he didn't say goodbye to his family, his friends, and when he got his training, was meant to come back into the country via Rhodesia, which is now known as Zimbabwe, but unfortunately, he got stopped at a roadblock, and now there are many tales as to what might have happened to him, that he actually was shot in a fig tree while trying to protect the family whose farm he was living on. Others say that, he might have actually been shot at that roadblock. So let's bring in now Basil's brother, Terry, to talk about this. And, Terry, I can see you already look emotional. Just listening in, reading up, I should say, on your brother Basil. It's a fascinating story. But let's start at the point at which he left without saying goodbye.
Yes, it was. He said there was no notification of him leaving. But, during those years, Basil's political activity was intense. And for him not to return home for 3-4 days wasn't unusual. So the initial 2 days, 3 days didn't really create concern for us at home. But when it got to the 8th, 9th, 10th day, then we knew that there's something drastically wrong here. And then it obviously went into months and years, but we didn't know where he was. And the reason for the non-disclosure of his departure was simply because of security reasons, to protect the family, so that when the security forces do come to our homes, which they did, we wouldn't know where he went. And that was the honest truth. We never knew. And the security forces over the years came to our house multiple times. In fact, continued to sit blatantly outside our home to make their presence known, that they are there. So yeah, it was a very sad time. It was a very concerning time for us, not knowing where Basil was, and it was 3/4 way during his second year as a medical student, and it concerned my parents tremendously.
And I mean, let's talk about the fact that this was happening in a time when there were no cell phones, So did you ever get a letter? When did you then finally realize or know, if at all, that he was actually now an MK operative and that he was, somewhere out there and meant to come back via Zimbabwe?
Well, let me say, you're correct. I mean, at the time, there was the technology that we have today wasn't there. The attempt was made by my mother. At the time, there was a popular radio station called LM Radio, and Mum would send birthday wishes to him in the hope that he will respond. But that response never came. And when I went into exile myself, that's when I discovered that Basil was with MK, with Umkhonto weSizwe. And the late O.R. Tambo briefed me thoroughly, The late Chris Honey spoke to me at length. Some of Basil's comrades who survived the Wankie campaign spoke to me at length. And Owa Tambo made his office available to leave no stone unturned to find Basil's remains. But we weren't successful, So the support was there from the structures and particularly from Owa Tambo's office, but we weren't successful.
One of the curious things, of course, especially in this process, is the tracking and tracing. It's unclear. There are many, it seems to be differing stories as to what actually happened to Basil. How did you then go about discovering, firstly, that he had been stopped in a roadblock because his nom de jure was actually Paul Peterson, which was a combination of your mother and father's name, respectively. But also finding out then the true story of what happened to him.
There are many stories about how Basil died. But the one consistent story that we have, and that was told to us, and that I sat with comrades, and I reference here, for instance, the late Chris Honey, was that Basil, the Lutuli detachment had an engagement a week before that with the joint South African military forces and then Rhodesian forces. And they were successful, and as a result, they recovered from the South African and Rhodesians much food in their knapsacks, but also their radios. So when Basil broke away on his mission to come to the Western Cape, because before the mission started, he was appointed the commander, the MK commander of the Western Cape, and to establish the units there. They indicate to me that they could listen on these radios the roadblock where Basil ran into and the fights that occurred. So the story is that he fought for more than 4 hours until his ammunition ran out, and as a result, he was killed. So that is the overwhelming and the more consistent story that we have heard. I've also read other stories about how he possibly have died. Yeah.
And standing here today in 2024, and Basil, joined MK in 1964, and we know what subsequently happened. As someone who never even said goodbye to him, you never expected this, and which means the last picture of him was probably in his early 20s. How does it feel?
It feels surreal. The last picture we have of Basil was when he was 19, because that's the time when he left the country. Having just witnessed the exhumation of Basil's remains last week, those were the thoughts that went through my head. I have not seen him as a 24-year-old. What would he have looked like? The experts at the grave could explain to me that he was well built, that he was about 5'8", 5'9", and that his health was in good condition, and that his dentures were perfect, and that his wisdom teeth was just coming out. And they said to me he must have been between the ages of 22, 25, and I said, well, when he died, he was 24, and they said, well, there we go,
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that story with us. That's Terry February speaking about his brother Basil, who left without saying goodbye to his family, was meant to actually start his own guerrilla unit in the Western Cape in Umkhonto Wesizwe, said did not say goodbye to his family, and today he returns with that military plane that's due to land here at Waterkloof Air Force Base.